this point, we've been taking the task of instantiating the connections ourselves, managing their life cycle. More typically, we want to leave that task to the server. Right? That there's an infrastructure that manages the life cycle of these connections for us. At the beginning, when it boots up, it instantiates these connections and puts them in a pool. They are then shared and never closed, right? And it can be configured so that the pool can grow and shrink depending on the load of the server over time. So that you start off with maybe 10 connections, and as the load grows throughout the day, the server can then decide to instantiate 10 more, right? Whatever. This is called throttling. The server throttles how many connections it needs throughout the day, and once the load goes down, right, it then starts to release these connections, and release some of the RAM and footprint that it needs to maintain all this in-memory data structures. So Tomcat certainly supports some of these behaviors, and by an API, a SQL API that is a part of the JavaX SQL package. Notice that it's not the Java SQL package; it's the JavaX SQL package. Right, so it's the extended version of SQL, right? That implements this, right? Which is what the J2EE infrastructure uses, right? For enterprise, this is what you would use, right? So the data source allows to decouple the lifecycle management, right? It's no longer going to be the responsibility of each one of your source. Instead, is the infrastructure, and this is a very common technique in the new object componentized architecture, right? Where you no longer write a lot of the code. Instead, you rely on a lot of services that the infrastructure provides for you, right? That you're not running standalone. You are running inside of an infrastructure that provides multi-threading, provides security, provides network connectivity, provides database connectivity, transaction management. None of the things that you would want to have to deal with. The server handles that for you, right? The infrastructure handles that for you. You're just one little component in a bigger infrastructure, right? So the way it works is that we need to tell Tomcat that indeed we wanted that when it boots up, we wanted to instantiate certain number of connections for us, right? We need to tell it what vendor we're using. We're using MySQL. We need to tell it the URL connection to connect to a database. So instead of us being responsible for doing this, right, the server is responsible for doing this, right, when it boots up. And how it logs into a database, how many do we want at the beginning, right? And once it instantiates it, it's going to make them all available at a naming service so that it can be retrieved by some keyword that you choose. Okay? The naming service that we use is the Java naming service, the JNDI, Java Naming Directory Interface, naming and directory interface, and we make it available at a particular string that we decide, that the team decides where is it available. You configure that either at Tomcat context.xml, or you can do it at Eclipse. Since from Eclipse we declared a server, and we declared our we declare ours as a dynamic web application. You can declare a context.xml under the meta-inf, and what it'll do is that it'll take your context.xml, right, and we'll concatenate it with Tomcat's own context.xml, right? It'll use yours as a configuration of the server, All right, so let's do that. Let's grab this. Do we have a server? Is it running? It's not running. Good, it stopped. So for our lecture here, we're under the meta-inf right here. We're going to create a brand new XML document. Web.xml, there it is. XML file. And it has to be called context.xml. Context.xml. And we're going to just paste in ours. Right? And it's going to declare it's going to instantiate these connections. So by the time the server boots up, by the time it gets to our code, all the connections will be already connected, right? And they won't be let go until the server goes down, right? So we'll give it another name. Maybe we'll call it lectures. And we want it to connect to lectures here. Lectures. Okay. All right. But this is the name that we really care about. This is all Tomcat specific configuration. Right? You can have any number of resources configure at the same time. You can have connecting to different databases, right? And you can choose which data source you want to use. Right? Again, it's decoupling the management, the lifecycle management of these resources. All right, so we did that. The next thing is to, from our project, declare that we want to use that particular resource that is being managed by someone else. Right? To do that, we're going to declare a resource reference that's going to reference that resource, that data source, okay, by name. By the name you declared it, which I think we named it lectures now, right? And we do that in the web.xml. Web.xml is a standard J2EE across all servers. All servers support web.xml. Different servers have different context.xml, right? So this one is specific to Tomcat. This is vendor specific. So if you're using WebLogic or using WAS or using some other server, right? This will be different. Right? So this is for per vendor. Okay? Whereas the web.xml, this is standard across all servers. Okay? This is standard J2EE. So we're going to take this and we're going to go to our web.xml, which we should have one. I asked it to create one. If you remember, it asked me, do you want a web.xml? I said, yes, I want it. This web.xml configures the generic behavior of the web context. For instance, it declares all the default files, index.html, index.jsp, default. If you want to declare home.html, is also very common HTML. So if you don't provide any particular, if you don't ask for any particular HTML file, this is what you'll get, the index file, right? So after this, we're gonna paste in our declaration that references our data source, and I think I called it lectures. Okay. So locally, now our code, can refer to this local reference, which will then reference whatever the server is declared, right? And it's looked up in this naming service called JNDI, right? The Java Naming and Directory Interface. And so an instance of this object will be available in JNDI at this keyword. Okay? You can put anything in JNDI, but you shouldn't put anything. You should put resources, right? Resources that are very expensive to instantiate. Okay, that you want to have these singletons, like publish, subscribe, queues, LDAP, security configurations, things that are very expensive that should be instantiated only once when the server starts up, okay? And then you want to retrieve them by name. Okay, it used to be that we didn't know what JNDI was, 17 years ago, and people were just putting everything in it. Right? They didn't know what it was for, but it's for resource management, right? All right, okay, it's there. from within my source code, from within my source code, I want to be able to access it now. Okay. So one of the simplest ways to access it, right, is to use a dynamic page, right from a page. So let's declare a simple JSP dynamic server page to access that. Right. So we'll call this simple data source JSP. So we want to, this is the simplest way. I mean, we can also do it from a servlet, but we'll do that in a minute. So this is a very simple index page. We can just say hello here, h1. Hello from simple data source, example. Okay, let's run it. There it is, run it from the server. Let's see, run as on the server. There it is. So it's a simple, it looks like an HTML page, right? But it's a little more than that. It's a dynamic, you can embed code in here. In particular, you can embed Java code, right? So let's see how we can connect to the database here using this new mechanism, right? Certainly, you can use the mechanism we've seen so far, right? Of actually logging into a database and using the technique we just illustrated earlier, but because this is a component inside my web container, I can now use instead. I can use another mechanism, go get that data source that JNDI has declared at this particular spot. Right? So let's do that. Let's do that. Okay. We're going to first get a hold of JNDI, the naming service, right? So that we can then go and fetch the instance that is in the naming service, right? So let's do that. Let's grab the naming service. Okay, this instantiates, gets hold of the current naming service. We need to import it. The way you import in JSPs is a little bit different. You say Java, a page, this is a page. You want to import these initial context, and that is declared in Java X naming. So Java X.naming.star. Okay, so I'm loading all the classes under the naming package. Okay, right. So this gives us the root, all those names that of all these instances that are in the naming service. They're organized in a hierarchy, right? That you can navigate using slashes, very much like you would a directory structure, right, in a file system. Yes, and it declares certain dedicated spots in this tree, in this hierarchical tree. Okay, some of them are specific for databases, some of them are specific for security, some of them are specific for entities, right? Some of them have very particular uses, right, in this hierarchy tree. One of them is for environmental variables, right? And this is it has a specific name, comp/env. Right. So let's grab that context, and these nodes in this hierarchical tree, each node is referred to as a context. Right. Each node is a context. So we're going to navigate the context, the nodes in this hierarchical tree. I am currently at the environment context, or that root or that branch in this hierarchical tree. Okay, and in there, I'm going to look up and the way you navigate left or right into this branch is through this function called lookup, which is equivalent of doing like a CD into a directory structure. Right, lookup is the same, right? CD, and you give it a path, right? Or lookup, and you give it a path, right? It navigates the hierarchy of this tree. So there it is. So under the environment directory structure, we have the lectures. That's where we declared it, right? And it's going to look it up, and you can store really anything in JNDI, any data of any data type, right? So it's stored in of type object. You need to cast it back to the original data type, which was stored in that naming service, right? And we know that it was declared to be of type data source, Java X data source, right? And so we are casting it back into its original data type when we put it in there, right? Well, not us. Tomcat put it in there, right, when it booted up. All right, so we need to import that. Let's import that as well. So that's under java x.sql.data source. Data source. There it is. Maybe? No? Is it Java X? Oh, it's just Java. Java, not Java X. I thought it was Java X. Oh, maybe this is a comma, maybe? Is this a comma? Oh, yeah, there we go. And this is M context. There we go. All right, now we have a data source. Once you have the data source, right, everything else is the same. Right? The data source plays the same part as a driver manager from the other way of doing it. But notice that we're not responsible for handling the management of the lifecycle. Now we can just get a connection from the data source. ds.get connection. Without logging in, without the URL, right? All that has been done already. Right? This is just saying, hey, data source, give me a connection from that pool of connections. I know you already have like 30 of them over there. I don't care which one. Just give me the one that's idle, right? And there's also an idle time, right? It means that even if somebody else is using it in a different thread, right? Before it's declared being available for someone else, there's a timeout, right? So like 100 milliseconds. And if somebody's not doing anything with a connection for more than 100 milliseconds, they lose the connection. Right? If someone else needs it, they just grab it. Right? This is a much more efficient use of connections, since I'm not destroying the connections and re-instantiating and then reusing it and then recreating it again. Right? It's much more a good use of resources. And now we need the connection, so let's load that as well. And that is in java.sql.star. There we go. Once we have the connection, everything else is the same. Right? So the only new things that you need to learn about using these data sources are these 3 lines, okay, and how to set it up, obviously. How do you set it up? Okay, once we have the connection, we can start actually communicating with the database. We can, for instance, go get all the websites, right? We can say, create a statement. We can say connection dot create a statement, and we can say statement dot execute query. Execute. We can give it select star from website, right? And this returns a result set. Result set. Just like we did earlier, right? RS. This execute query. Sorry, execute query. And then we can just iterate over this, right? So we can say while rs.next, the same code we had earlier. So we can say here int id rs.get integer id. And let's get just a name here. So string name, and this gets rs.get string, and then this is the name of the website. Okay. Now to display this, I guess we could display like a list of websites. So maybe let's build a dynamic unordered list. Okay, and then here we can embed some HTML in here, so we can stop the Java and then go back to Java. Okay, but meanwhile, while we are outside of Java, we can render an li in the loop and display here the name of the website. Okay, so let's try to just run this now. I don't know if this is going to work. We might need to restart the server. I think it restarted, maybe. There we go. There we go. We have Facebook and Twitter, right? So this went out to the database, right, and fetched the data, right, and displayed it here. Okay. But we broke our own rule, right? We're accessing data directly where we need it. Right? Instead, we should have gone through the data access object. I only wanted to point out the fact of being able to use the context, right, to retrieve the data, right? So let's refactor this to use instead the data access object. But everybody okay about being able to retrieve this? So let's stop this and instead use the data access object.